It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the ViewSonic XG2530. This is a 240Hz TN twisted pneumatic model with a full HD, that's 1920 by 1080 resolution. So it's not going to win any sort of competitions in terms of pixel density. It doesn't give you an awful lot of working area for the desktop or for work, for browsing the internet, that kind of thing. And it doesn't give you an amazing amount of detail or clarity in images or games or anything like that, blah blah blah. Anyone who knows anything about this monitor will know it's really designed for competitive gaming or fast-paced gaming. It's a high refresh rate model with a rapid response time promised. So this is just a sort of relatively brief review. I say relatively brief, it's brief compared to the written review, which is a lot more detailed, but anyone who has seen my video reviews on YouTube in the past will know that I can go on quite a bit, so don't expect this to be too quick, I can't promise that. But I would definitely have a look at the written review, and that's linked to in the description of the video. There's also a link to information about how you can support the work that we do on the website and also here on YouTube. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is a little about the aesthetics of the monitor, what you can see on the outside rather than the image quality and image performance. It doesn't look massively different to its predecessor, the ViewSonic XG2401. One thing I kind of like about it, they've made the stand a bit thinner, a bit narrower. It doesn't go as far back, so it doesn't take up as much space on the desk, which is nice if you don't have a massive amount of desk space. You can see that it's got a sort of red go faster stripe, if that's what you want to call it. So it does have a red accent. It's also got orange button labels. They're not illuminated, although they might look slightly illuminated in the video. It also has moderately thick bezels. I mean, they're not particularly thick, they're actually fairly thin, but they're not as thin as some models, and they don't have this sort of dual stage design where you have a very thin outer component but a bit of a panel border. It's actually just that the panel border is actually completely covered by the hard outer bezel all around the monitor. At the rear of the monitor you can see a red vertical stripe, a red cable tidy loop and a red ViewSonic logo, but elsewhere you can see that matte black plastic is used. There's sort of slightly different textures used in various places. There's a kind of tin foil style texture here, not shiny, but just a sort of pattern to it there. There's also a Kensington lock slot. As you can see, I've just knocked it, the cable tidy at the back, it is detachable. It attaches quite loosely and it's a little bit flimsy. It's quite easy to knock down and get it out of position, and it just rattles around a bit. There, it's a bit more firmly in there if you push it up, but it's quite quickly will just become loose again. If I take that out, you'll see the way it basically just sits in there, and that thing goes up into there. So it's a bit of a flimsy little addition. I think they probably could have done a bit of a better job with that, to be honest, but it's nothing critical on the monitor in my opinion. There's a retractable headphone hook towards the top of the stand, and if you pull this out, it's actually quite firm. It's hard to pull out, as you can see. Once you pull that out, it's not exactly the widest of headphone hooks. I've got a pair of gaming headphones here, and because they've got a sort of flexible band on the bottom, they do fit over. It kind of does the job, but I think it would have been better if it was a little bit broader personally, but you can, depending on your headphone design, possibly put them over the top there. This is exactly the same kind of thing I mentioned on the predecessor to this model. The ports, very important, are down firing because the stand attaches by 100 by 100mm VESA screws, or VESA depending on how you want to say it, and you can detach that and use an alternative stand if you prefer. There is an AC power input, which means that the monitor has an internal power converter. There's not a power brick. and there is an HDMI 1.4. I'm not sure which order these are in actually. I haven't plugged in the monitor yet. I've done this as sort of the first thing. I haven't actually plugged it into my computer yet and tested this out, but there is HDMI 1.4, HDMI 2.0, could be the other way around, DisplayPort 1.2a, which supports adaptive sync and can therefore be used with AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs. And there are a couple of USB 3 ports and a USB 3 upstream, plus a 3.5mm headphone jack. Although you can't really see them, there are also a couple of basic up-firing speakers as well. I'm now on Battlefield 1 on a fairly dark map, which I feel is good for talking a bit about contrast. It's a TN panel, as I've mentioned, so it doesn't have IPS glow or anything like that. If you're not familiar with IPS glow, it's basically a sort of bloom you'll see in the corners of the screen in particular, as you're viewing it from a normal viewing position, and if you go off angle, that bloom kind of becomes even more exaggerated, and it eats away at detail towards the bottom corners of the screen in particular from a normal viewing position, and it's just not a very nice thing. Some people don't really much like it, which is completely understandable. In terms of imperfections on this being a TN panel, it doesn't have completely consistent gamma across the screen. The perceived gamma is actually higher up the screen and lower down the screen, which means that you can actually see extra detail lower down the screen compared to higher up the screen, and actually higher up the screen some of the details that you should be able to see are masked a bit. This isn't very easy to show you in game because the lighting's quite dynamic on this game, but you might be able to see towards the top of the screen, I mean, I'm not sure if you can see, but what I can see towards the top of the screen, there's not really much detail at all in the rock face here, but lower down the screen there's more detail. Again, I mean, you know, it's dynamic lighting, it's a bit of a dodgy demonstration, but I mean, I didn't want to spend too long going through this kind of thing on the desktop. Might show some clear examples there, but you just have to take my word for it that sort of higher up the screen there's less detail, lower down the screen there's more detail, and you can see a kind of flashlight effect. I mean, it looks like my character's holding a flashlight. It's sort of like illuminating the rock face towards the bottom of the screen. That is partly the perceived gamma differences that I've mentioned before. And actually, if I move the camera, it'll exaggerate the effect, but this will probably show you more what I'm talking about. So if you move it up, you see the detail levels get a lot better. You actually can see more detail than you should be able to. And if I move it down, just you know, it all disappears, the detail's all masked. So, you know, that's one of the imperfections you have with TN models, and it's not unique to this model. It's something that all TN models suffer from. The contrast performance, the static contrast, I measured around 800 to 1 using my test settings, which I'm using at the moment. So it's a little bit weaker than the 1000 to 1 specified, but not really, I wouldn't really say significantly so. I mean, in terms of perceived static contrast, it's really not very different to any sort of TN panel that would give you sort of 1000 to 1 or so anyway. So it's certainly not a VA model in terms of nice sort of inky looking dark shades and that kind of thing, but you know, it's reasonable. I mean, brighter shades stand out fairly well against darker backgrounds, and it doesn't really have a sort of flooded look, I would say. So, you know, it's all right in that respect. At the higher end, the brighter shades, they're displayed with a little bit of graininess, and the screen surface is very similar to what's used on 144 Hz TN models that I've tested with full HD resolutions. So there is a bit of graininess to the screen surface, but it's not too bad. It's not kind of the heavy smeary grain that some older IPS panels in particular used to have. But you know, it is a little bit grainier than some matte screen surfaces with a smoother surface texture, lighter matte screen surfaces. I mean, there's not really much more to say about the contrast. It's, I mean, if I'm to sum it up in sort of one sentence, I'd say it's decent. It's pretty much as I'd expect for a TN panel, really. I'm now on a somewhat more colourful map. I mean, it's not super colourful, but I've chosen this one as it highlights certain things that I'd like to talk about, certain weaknesses with TN panels, which of course this has. The colour reproduction overall is actually not too bad. I mean, as far as TN models go, it's perfectly decent. Some gaming monitors with high refresh rates, and I mean, it's not just unique to them, but they certainly tend to have it more than others. They tend to have lower than expected central gamma, and that means that everything has a kind of slightly flooded, washed out look. This model doesn't have that issue, thankfully. The central gamma tracking is actually quite good, and it also gives you a range of gamma settings in the OSD, which is nice, so you have a little bit of flexibility in that respect as well. Being a TN panel, and as I've mentioned in the contrast section, the gamma is, the perceived gamma does change depending on which part of the screen you're looking at, and in particular it's higher up the screen and lower down the screen. Basically that means that shades look more saturated. You can see it on the video even. They look more saturated towards the top of the screen, and less saturated towards the bottom of the screen. So you can see the Earth here has a kind of I mean, it looks more or less as it should centrally, whereas it looks a bit sort of too rich further up. Has a sort of reddy brown hue that it shouldn't really have, and lower down it has a kind of washed out clay-like look. I mean, I shouldn't really say washed out, but you know, it's less saturated. And if you move the camera around, you can see this effect a bit more clearly. I mean, right near the top of the screen, it actually almost looks like there's a kind of little sun visor or something at the top. I mean, that's perfectly normal for TN panel. It's not at all unique to this model. It's just because the perceived gamma is a lot higher right at the top of the screen compared to lower down. The colour gamut of the monitor, it's tracks quite closely to sRGB. It actually offers very good sRGB colour gamut coverage. It has a little bit of extension beyond that actually to invite a little bit of extra vibrancy, a little bit of extra saturation to some shades. So definitely compared to a lot of the gaming monitors, the sort of TN panels you might have in your mind comparing this to, especially the ones with the dodgy gamma, which I mentioned before, this model, you know, does have a sort of richer look to colours overall, which is good. I mean, you can't really see them so much here because it's a sort of dusty desert environment with plenty of khaki shades, but there are some of the greens on this monitor actually look fairly rich overall, which is nice, gives vegetation a nice kind of lush look. I mean, explosions have a fairly decent sort of orange, quite vibrant orange look to them as well. I'll see if I can create one here. But you have to remember, what you see on the video does not actually represent what you'd see firsthand on the monitor. Everything's really kicking off now, unsurprisingly. It depends on the camera that I'm using. It depends on your own monitor, of course, and it depends on the processing that's done in the movie software that I've been using and YouTube. So it in no way represents the actual colours that you see firsthand. But this is just really a prompt for me to be able to go through some of the main points about the monitor and the colour reproduction. And I'm sure you'll be very eager for me to move very swiftly onto the responsiveness section of the monitor, which of course is very, very much what this monitor is all about. So just before I die, I'll do that. I'm actually going to start this video on the loading screen because I just like to show you that as pretty much every monitor I've seen using FreeSync, or possibly every monitor without exception, there is a little bit of flickering on loading screens. That's completely normal for the technology. It's where the frame rate drops very low, or it essentially pauses at some points. The monitor does flicker. It's a FreeSync issue. It's a much wider issue. It doesn't just affect this monitor, and I will be talking about FreeSync first of all, because it's something which is sort of a key feature of this monitor. It's not what I'd call an essential feature, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. But I'm running with an AMD Radeon 290, and it does support AMD FreeSync, the graphics card, and so does the monitor, so it is using it, which is nice. And I might as well just talk a little bit about the technology whilst this is loading up. It's a variable refresh rate technology, and what it does is it allows the monitor's refresh rate to dynamically adjust to match the frame rate of the content. And I've written various articles, and there's a big sort of piece in the written review to give more technical background about this, and I don't intend to go on too much about that. But basically what it does is it removes the tearing that you might see traditionally when the frame rate and the refresh rate mismatches, or doesn't match I should say, isn't synchronized. So it removes the tearing that you might get if you've got VSync off and you've got the mismatches, and it also removes the stuttering that you'd get if you've got VSync on. So it does smooth things out, and I do like it. And I'm just going to display the refresh rate of the monitor, and the frame rate of the game, which the monitor will match with its refresh rate, I should say. So you can actually see, I mean, this is a 240 Hz monitor, so it runs at up to 240 frames a second. It'll give you a good experience up to 240 frames a second. I don't know if you can see that, it's quite small, and I don't want to move the camera because it's nicely mounted on the tripod, but it's basically around 200 frames a second at the moment. I mean, that's obviously a very high frame rate. I've actually done some of my testing with a NVIDIA GTX 1070, and that's just because it's a little bit more powerful than this graphics card, and it allows me to test things a bit more easily, sort of right at the top end, 240 frames a second. But even then, it is actually very difficult to maintain that kind of frame rate on a title like Battlefield 1. So I'll show you my video settings with my Radeon 290. I've basically got everything on the low preset, and if I did want that to, I could actually decrease the resolution scale a bit if I wanted perhaps a little bit more performance. But even then, it's not quite hitting 240. And this is where FreeSync sort of comes into its own, because if you're not matching 240 Hz with 240 frames a second output, then these issues that I talked about with the stuttering and tearing, they do come into play, whereas with FreeSync they don't come into play. So it's very nice to not have them. But I should mention, especially when I was testing at these sort of 200 frames a second plus before with my NVIDIA card, or when I had FreeSync disabled on this one, I didn't actually find the tearing particularly bothersome. I didn't really notice distinct tear lines, and that's completely normal. At very high frame rates like this, those kind of issues are actually far more marginal. They're far less significant. And yes, I mean, I did notice the issue, and I do like to not have the... it wasn't really the tearing so much, but the juddering that you get, because different sections of the screen are displaying different frames, essentially, when there's this mismatch. And I did notice that, but I didn't find it particularly bothersome at such high frame rates. So actually I was quite happily just playing with my NVIDIA graphics card at such frame rates. But certainly with this sort of fluctuations, I mean, if I turn my graphics settings up a bit, because I mean, I think it's fair to say many people don't really want to play with everything on low. If I turn things up a bit, you can see that things are now sort of closer to 100 frames a second. And I mean, with FreeSync on, I do find it gives me a bigger bonus here, because I do find the stuttering and the tearing a lot more noticeable with it off at this kind of refresh rate and frame rate range. And again, if it goes even lower, then again it becomes even more obvious. And yes, I mean, I do like the technology. But certainly at the higher frame rates, I don't see it as essential. Now, anybody who has seen any of my recent video reviews, when I talk about responsiveness, especially the ones with the VA panels, will know I love to use this particular scene from Battlefield 1 because it shows some of these high contrast transitions which VA models really do struggle with. I mean, this model, it has really very good pixel responsiveness. I have it set up as per the test settings in the review, so I'm actually using the ultra fast response time setting. And as I mentioned in the review, I think the faster mode, the default, is really good as well, but I think at the really high frame rates, ultra fast has a slight edge. There's a little bit of extra trailing with the faster mode in places, which it just sort of takes the edge off that, having it on ultra fast. As I said, it's sort of running around 200 frames a second. It does sort of creep up a bit closer to the 240. But really, that sort of the maximum potential of this monitor does come when you're having those really high frame rates. You get a much lower level of perceived blur, especially compared to a 60 Hz monitor or running this monitor at 60 Hz. The difference is quite profound. This means it's easier to, when you're moving around quickly, the map essentially remains sharper, and you can track enemies more easily, and actually some users find it a lot more comfortable on the eyes as well, and that kind of thing. So if you're a competitive gamer, this particular aspect is really good, the lowered perceived blur, and that is linked to the frame rate. So as my frame rate drops, even though I've got FreeSync enabled, you do lose some of that. Compared to running at lower frame rates, or really compared to a 144 Hz monitor, because that's an interesting comparison, this model does, when it's running at higher frame rates, it does offer a reduction in perceived blur, which is nice. But I mean, I don't really find the difference profound in terms of for games like this and the kind of games I play. I'd say 144 Hz is sufficient, although there is an advantage beyond that if you've got the frame rate to match. Competitive gamers, yes, they certainly, they could get a competitive edge from the extra frame rate and refresh rate. Another area that the increased frame rate and refresh rate combination is very good at improving is the connected feel. So that's kind of how connected you feel. It's quite self-explanatory, really, isn't it? It's how sort of the interactions with the game world feel, and it's input lag is, especially signal delay, which is the element of input lag that you feel is also pivotal to this. But actually running at a higher frame rate just gives you a sort of as you interact with the game world, it just feels more connected. It's something that's a lot easier to feel than it is to actually for yourself, than it is to sort of explain on a video. But and again, that decreases as the frame rate decreases, and even with AMD FreeSync, that doesn't make a difference. Lower frame rates are still lower frame rates, so that is something that's maximised at higher frame rates. But it's an excellent, in my opinion, the connected feel of this monitor is excellent. I mean, there is, to some users, I did mention input lag, and I can't really avoid the sort of elephant in the room. This model, it does have low input lag, but it doesn't have extremely low input lag. So in the written review, I actually measured around, I think it was 8 seconds, 8 seconds, yeah, that would be awful, 8 milliseconds, sorry, of input lag, and that includes the signal delay and an element of pixel responsiveness. But as I've mentioned, really the pixel responses of this monitor are very snappy, so that does suggest that there's a sort of a slight signal delay on this monitor. Most users actually won't be able to notice this, and they won't have a problem with it. But certainly, as I've mentioned, this monitor is really geared more towards competitive gamers. And again, some of them won't notice it, won't have a problem with it, and that's fine, but some will. I was actually contacted on Twitter by NVC, a competitive gamer. His Twitter handle's just NVC. He also does video reviews at the moment. He's reviewing this monitor, or has reviewed this monitor on YouTube. Definitely, if you're a competitive gamer, check out his work. It's really good, and he's got a really keen eye for responsiveness as well. And he's very sensitive to input lag. And he actually mentioned to me on Twitter whilst I was reviewing this, because he knew I was reviewing this model. He said, there's something just feels a bit sort of heavy around the when I'm using this monitor. You know, something just feels slightly off to me. And he thought he was just going a bit mad, and surely this monitor would have super low input lag, so it's not that. But actually, as I mentioned, it does have a little bit of input lag. So he did feel that, and it felt a bit off to him. So, you know, I'm not going to hide the fact that some users would find this problematic, but I'd say that most users won't. So, I mean, I'm not going to say too much more about that. It is a very subjective thing, and I don't really want people to worry about that unnecessarily unless they know for a fact that they're very sensitive to input lag. So, I mean, there's not too much more to say about the responsiveness of this monitor. But there are a few slight weaknesses in the pixel responsiveness, even at these really high frame rates that can be supported. And I'm not actually going to be able to show them on the video because they really are slight weaknesses, and I talk about them quite extensively in the written review, so I shouldn't really say too much about them. It's just a tiny bit of powdery trailing, and sort of a tiny little bit of overshoot here and there. Really very slight, nothing to really worry about. So I don't really think I should say too much more about that. But I think I should mention, as I've mentioned on other models that use FreeSync, I tend to find that G-Sync models actually have better response time tuning, pixel response time tuning, for the range of refresh rates under which they operate. This monitor, it's actually quite good as far as FreeSync models go, but I'm just going to up the detail level quite a lot to try and get a much lower frame rate. I'm going to have to increase it a bit more than that. I think if I increase the resolution scale, it should do what I'm trying to. Okay, so at slightly lower frame rates, well, much lower frame rates compared to the upper end of this, there's a bit of overshoot, which is a bit more noticeable. I'm not sure if you can see it on the video, but there's a kind of like a halo trailing around the horse. Maybe I'll be able to see a more obvious example. There's actually kind of like a dark silhouette trailing around the moon as well. I'm sure these telegraph posts, which anyone who have seen my recent VA reviews will know that I love these telegraph posts for showing overshoot, inverse ghosting. It's not too obvious. Yeah, you can see sort of a bit of overshoot around the telegraph wires at the top there. But anyway, this is actually just because I'm using the ultra fast setting, and as I said, this does give a bit of an edge at the really high frame rate. But if you're playing a game where you're actually dipping a lot to much lower frame rates, for example, really below 100 frames a second a lot, I'd say, then I'd suggest just sticking with the faster setting. Even if you do happen to sort of creep up with your frame rate to really high values, this still does a decent job. It's not a huge difference, and actually I find it kind of difficult to choose between that and ultra fast when I was deciding on my test settings for the review. So if you are sensitive to overshoot and you're spending a lot of time at lower frame rates, just use the faster setting, which is the default anyway. It's absolutely fine, and it gets rid of a lot of the overshoot. I mean, there is a little bit remaining, but it's not, it's not particularly pronounced. So to wrap up then, externally, the monitor looks, fairly sort of plain, really, I suppose you could say. It doesn't have any really flashy, bright, colourful features other than the sort of fairly subdued sort of red accents here and there. I like the way that they've made the stand a bit narrower, so you can push it further back on the desk. So that's a nice little addition or change from the ViewSonic XG2530. In terms of the image performance, no monitor's perfect, and this is no exception. Responsiveness is really this key strength of this monitor, and I mean, anyone who has read a bit about the monitor, even without really seeing an in-depth review, will know that that's the case. It offers a 240Hz refresh rate, and it can deliver a good performance for both AMD and NVIDIA users. AMD users have the advantage of being able to use adaptive sync on the monitor, so they can use AMD FreeSync on their graphics card, and that delivers an even smoother experience in terms of reducing tearing or stuttering that you'd get if you have the technology disabled or you can't use the technology. But as I'd mentioned, I think at the really high frame rates and refresh rates, this particularly the tearing is not really that noticeable, and I think even Nvidia users can actually get a lot of enjoyment out of this monitor as well. The pixel responsiveness, there are only some real minor weaknesses. Overall, the pixel responsiveness is excellent. It delivers a really solid 240Hz performance, and it delivers a really solid performance at other lower refresh rates as well. As with other AMD FreeSync models, I do find that there's not really one perfect setting that you can use for the pixel overdrive that will give you sort of optimal performance across the entire range. I actually found ultrafast worked best at the higher frame rates. Really anything above, I mean, it's quite arbitrary, but anything above sort of 80 frames a second or so, I'd happily use ultrafast. But really the faster mode worked absolutely fine. I mean, most users probably wouldn't be able to tell a difference between the two anyway, because the default faster mode is actually very good. I do feel it has a little bit of an edge, the faster mode, actually, at the lower frame rates, below 80 frames a second. And it's only really above 200 frames a second or so that I'd say that the ultra fast mode, for me, had some sort of real advantages. And again, they weren't massive advantages, but just slight advantages. So, I mean, most users perhaps just stick with the faster mode, others use the ultra fast, just experiment. It's all subjective, see what you find best. In terms of the image quality, the monitor doesn't have this sort of plague which affects some of the competing models and quite a few of the 144Hz Full HD TN models, and that is, it doesn't have dodgy gamma. Its gamma handling in terms of the central average is decent, and it tracks quite nicely to give sort of a fairly rich look overall. It is a TN panel, so there is a loss of saturation further down the screen, lower perceived gamma lower down the screen, higher perceived gamma higher up the screen, more saturation. So, you know, that's the same weaknesses shared with any TN model, so I'm not really going to be too critical of that. But yeah, I mean, it's not, you know, it's not an IPS or VA in terms of the colour consistency, but overall it doesn't have the massive issues with gamma, so it doesn't look completely washed out in my view, so that's a positive really. Contrast, again, it's really quite typical for a TN model. It doesn't have any huge weaknesses. The static contrast was a little bit lower than 1000 to 1 that's specified for the model, but I'd say the perceived contrast is really very close to 1000 to 1 anyway. I think the screen surface, again, it didn't surprise me at all. It's really quite typical for 144Hz Full HD TN models like this. It's medium matte anti-glare, so there is a little bit of graininess here and there when you're looking at lighter colours in particular, lighter shades. But, you know, it's not heavy or smeary, and it's not something that makes you want to kind of, I don't know, sandpaper the monitor to death or rip your eyeballs out or anything like that. But again, it's subjective, and some users are more sensitive to this than others. I do personally prefer a lighter matte screen surface with less graininess, and that's something I'm quite particular about. But, you know, I didn't find this horrendous, so I suppose that's a good thing. So really that's all there is to it, the ViewSonic XG2530. This video review, I tried to keep it a bit shorter than some of them. I know I can waffle on for a very long time. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening. And be sure to check out the full written review, which is more detailed. And there is a link to that in the description of the video. There's also a link, which is equally important, if not more so. There's a link to a post on our forum about how you can actually support the work that we do, both on YouTube and in our written reviews on the website as well.